This is Into the Mix, a Ben & Jerry's podcast about joy and justice, produced with Vox Creative. I'm Ashley C. Ford. Last week on Into the Mix.
There are people who literally put their spirit, their soul, they put everything on the line so that the rest of us can actually enjoy this democracy. And Miss Livia is one of those people.
I began to see what she was experiencing. And I'm glad it wasn't me.
Everything I went through was voter suppression.
That last voice was Olivia Coley Pearson, former city commissioner in Douglas, a small town in Coffee County, Georgia. She's been active with social justice and voting rights issues in her community for decades. She was also the target of voter fraud allegations in 2016 for doing what she always does, helping people access their right to vote. It didn't matter that she didn't actually do anything illegal. The trial had its intended effect: fear.
I often talk about voter suppression, and it's like a three-legged stool. It comes where there's some kind of legal justification of creating barriers to weaponize the legal process to make it harder for people to vote, to weaponize the administrative process, and to create a culture of fear. That has always been the strategy of voter suppression.
That's Latasha Brown, co-founder of Black Voters Matter, one of the organizations Miss Livy partners with. In her several decades of fighting for voting rights, she noticed that there are three tactics often used to suppress the vote. In last week's episode, we talked about one of those tactics: fear. This week, how lawmakers in Georgia have legalized those scare tactics and how we fight back. Today's episode, the fight against voter suppression. Let's get into it. You have the firsthand, direct experience of seeing how voter suppression works, how pervasive it is, and how it not only changes the trajectory of an election, but we have elections in order to change or maintain our communities. So inevitably, it shapes our communities. It shapes our country. It shapes our world.
Absolutely. It shapes the policy priorities.
Right.
Like, it matters who's in office because it matters what policies are being pushed or put in place and what communities get to benefit from that, right? Whenever there has been Black progress in this nation, there's always been a backlash. Always. Yep. Right? Always. And so we saw this large scale right after Reconstruction, when you saw massive numbers of African-American voters participating in the process. You start seeing Black people be elected in office.
The 15th Amendment of 1869 guaranteed Black men the right to vote, and they did. Some 2,000 Black men and women were elected to public office after slavery ended. These Black officials were state legislators, sheriffs, city council members. We had 16 Black representatives in Congress during Reconstruction, 2 in the Senate and 14 in the House. But white supremacists could not stomach losing power. They couldn't stomach a multiracial government. So they rioted and massacred those Black political gains away.
The city of Wilmington, North Carolina is the best example. I think it was 1898, where a fusion party, where African Americans and white voters had gotten together and seen their similar interests.
Kareem Creighton is the vice president at the Brennan Center for Justice in their Washington, D.C. office. They are a nonpartisan public policy organization.
They were people who had not been favored with large landholding wealth and wanted policies that responded to laboring rights. And what the white landholders looked at and saw was, whoa, wait a minute. These guys could actually drive politics in ways that we don't like. And so what happened was a mix of misinformation and essentially instigating violence that essentially turned into one of America's only recorded coups. A duly elected local government that included African American and white voters, or white representatives, were basically tossed out of office, run out of town.
And that was the end of a multiracial political coalition in North Carolina. There are other examples throughout the Reconstruction era, like the Opelousas Massacre in Louisiana in 1868, or the Vicksburg Massacre in Mississippi in 1874. But in example after example, town after town, the message was clear.
Violence was itself a message, not just to police people who maybe stepped out of line in the view of white landowners who had just sort of been used to running everything. It was a message to the community that there are consequences if you should, see yourself as a person entitled to cast a ballot.
So Black people couldn't vote because it wasn't safe for them to exercise that right. Fast forward to the Civil Rights era and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965.
The Voting Rights Act, in some ways, was an answer to a series of prayers and a lot of work by people who had, for decades, wanted to, tried to, but were always denied the ability to have equal participation in the political process. John Lewis, who I think is, among the saints in our nation, if we ever had any, marched across that bridge and did, unfortunately had to do the kind of sacrifice that many of us, I think, today would, wince at. But he suffered blows.
The Voting Rights Act of 1965 provided direct federal protections to Black folks to be able to register to vote and cast a ballot. It dramatically increased political participation in Black communities in the following decades.
But more important than that even was the consensus, the bipartisan, multi-regional consensus that this law was necessary to make good on the promise of the 15th Amendment. And that had been true from 1965 when it was first enacted through the 70s, the 80s, and even as late as 2006, where a Republican Congress and a Republican president signed on to the notion that we need to have continued enforcement of this act.
Other communities have benefited from the Voting Rights Act as well.
It has expanded so that Latinos in our country, particularly starting in Texas, where many of the same communities had shown the kind of resistance to Latino political participation and representation as African Americans, but including also Asian Americans, Native Americans, and it's really made all of the difference.
Then in 2013, the Supreme Court chose to rule on a case called Shelby County v. Holder. They struck down a crucial protection in the Voting Rights Act that says states with a history of voter suppression had to get pre-clearance from the federal government before they changed any of their voting laws. The Supreme Court under Justice Roberts said the conditions that made the Voting Rights Act of 1965 necessary had been resolved. So he claimed those protections are no longer needed.
I should say a lot of us, I'm included in them, submitted amicus arguments to the court suggesting, no, you got it all wrong. What the other side of this argument that we shared offered was, well, Justice Roberts, you're arguing that you're seeing things get better. Just because you see things get better doesn't mean that the problem isn't there. We think that actually this just shows the effectiveness of the act. And so if the act is effective and you take the act away, simple subtraction tells you you're going to have these problems. What we found out immediately after the decision was rendered was that states very quickly jumped into the breach and decided to pass new legislation. And much of it was in the form of ultimately suppressive bills that made it more difficult for people to qualify to cast a ballot, or if they were registered, to get in and cast a ballot in practice.
This is where the voter suppression tactic of weaponizing the legal process enters the chat. The Brennan Center did a study that found that, yes, the Shelby decision decreased turnout in Black and brown communities, but that decrease is even more dramatic in places that needed the pre-clearance provision of the VRA. Voting rights advocates felt Shelby's impact immediately.
Doing any kind of voter registration and civic engagement drive in many places in America, but certainly in the South, is really coming into full conflict with sets of racist systems in America.
That's Lauren Grow-Wargo, the CEO of Fair Fight Action based in Georgia, a nonprofit organization that she co-founded with voting rights champion Stacey Abrams. Their goal is to make elections more accessible and equitable. So back in 2014, they started a voter registration drive with the New Georgia Project.
And when we started the New Georgia Project, that was the really first time that I understood personally and profoundly how real voter suppression was. So here's the deal. Nationally, in 2014, Georgia was not seen as a battleground, right? We were, trying to register as many folks as we could as part of the 2014 push and a long-term argument for the state.
They made a plan to turn Georgia, a long-standing red state, into a swing state. Their goal was to get as many eligible voters as possible to exercise their political power. But they came up against voter suppression instead. As they galvanized around voter registration, Lauren got a shock in the mail.
I just remember it was like a bigger envelope, and I pull it out, and I immediately tore it open. And my name, it was Brian Kemp, Secretary of State, hereby subpoenas Lauren Grow-Wargo for New Georgia Project, whack, whack, whack.
The then Secretary of State in Georgia, Brian Kemp, subpoenaed the New Georgia Project, accused them of committing voter fraud, and launched an investigation against them, all in the name of election security.
As I'm opening up the subpoena, Brian Kemp has his press conference and saying he's going to root out the voter fraud. We're going to get rid of the voter registration fraud. This shady outlet is, stealing identities. I mean, they launch a massive negative campaign on us. They've got people all over. They're going to just bury us.
But the New Georgia Project fought back, despite their terror.
We ended up having to launch a communications campaign because of the communications crisis to defend voter registration.
Voter registration drives have a long history that goes back to women's suffrage and, more recently, the civil rights era. They're really important to the health of our democracy. Black and Latino voters, naturalized citizens, people who didn't graduate from high school, these groups are all more likely to rely on third-party voter registration efforts in order to exercise their voting rights. And more registration means more people exercising their right to vote. It's as simple as that. As this public fight was underway, Brian Kemp got caught on tape saying the quiet part out loud during a private Republican fundraising event. The speech was published by Better Georgia.
The Democrats are working hard. There's all these stories about them, registering all these minority voters that are out there and others that are sitting on the sidelines. And if they can do that, they can win these elections in November.
Around the same time, the organizers at the New Georgia Project started to notice something strange with the applications of the people they helped register to vote.
My data folks came to me and Stacey and said, there's something weird here. Our forms aren't showing up in the system. That was the beginning, we didn't know it yet, of figuring out that our people were getting caught in exact match. Exact match was a way that if your hyphenated last name or you go by some nickname, right, that if your name does not exactly match how you are on your Social Security card, on your license, you get knocked out of the voter registration system either fully or put in pending status. Think about that, right? You think about people who've got apostrophes in their name, hyphens in their names, names that those names typically are women and people of color, right? At that moment, the New Georgia Project was predominantly registering African Americans in Georgia.
So if a person's first name is Liz on her voter registration form, but her driver's license record shows her first name as Elizabeth, then her file is placed in pending status until it is corrected. The same goes for someone who might drop a hyphen in their last name. This is one of the ways far-right politicians and so-called election security advocates in Georgia laid a claim to election integrity. They say if your name doesn't match exactly what's on record, you shouldn't be able to vote. A few years prior to the New Georgia Project's voter registration drives in 2014, then Secretary of State Brian Kemp tried to make exact match a law. But the protections from the VRA of 1965 kept that from happening.
The Obama DOJ had denied it, saying it disproportionately targeted Black folks, people of color, and women. So DOJ said, no, you can't do that.
But after the Supreme Court's Shelby decision in 2013...
Well, after Shelby, nobody knew it, but they just did it in the Secretary of State's office.
Exact match became a tool in the voter suppression toolkit in Georgia. An estimated 53,000 people were not able to vote in elections in 2018 because their names were flagged by the system. For context, the results of the last presidential election in Georgia was decided by a mere 11,000 votes. Then,
can you tell me a little bit about SB 202 and SB 189?
It's just horrible. It was a voter suppression bill. What this bill did is it tried to criminalize those of us who were really trying to protect and organize around democracy and provide some comfort care for people who had been standing in line 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 12 hours.
Also called the Election Integrity Act of 2021, SB 202 was enacted by Brian Kemp, who by then had been elected Georgia's governor after his stint as Secretary of State.
The governor signed, ironically, being flanked in a state that is extremely diverse. He couldn't find anybody but white men to flank him on the left and the right side as he signed the bill, sitting up under a picture of a Georgia plantation. And a picture of a plantation, like of a home during slavery.
Yes.
Right? So people can get the image of what I think message I feel like he was trying to send.
SB 202 was a direct response to historic voter turnout in 2020. In addition to criminalizing the provision of food and water to voters in a state with notoriously long lines on Election Day, the bill also attacks absentee voting and ballot drop-off boxes.
Like, imagine who has time to stand in a line for 12 hours to vote. We met a man that literally had stood in line for 12 hours. I personally went to a polling site where the last voter did not vote, had stood in line all night, had not voted until 12:37 a.m. Wednesday morning. Like, just think about how preposterous that is. Yeah. That I myself, it took me 4 hours to vote.
Latasha Brown's experience was in Georgia. More generally, though, long voter lines are a pervasive problem across states in the U.S. In 2020, more than half of the population of the U.S. lived in states where the wait time is over 11 minutes. However, voters in poorer neighborhoods were more likely to experience long waits at the polls compared with voters in higher income neighborhoods.
Yet when I go over to the other side of town, that I'm looking at people who are going in and voting 10 minutes top. I mean, that's getting in the car, going in, getting their ballots, coming back out, 10 minutes top, right?
Weaponizing the administrative process has now entered the chat. Long lines are absolutely a tactic of voter suppression.
I'll never forget one day, there was a woman in line who was actually having a diabetic response. And because there were people there to provide water and juice, right, she was okay.
April England Albright is the legal director and acting chief of staff of Black Voters Matter Fund.
So when you hear about the demonization of voter comfort food that this bill went squarely after, the reason why we say it was targeted towards, minority communities like Black communities was because that's where it was being provided, because that's where the long lines were.
Under what narrative is that ever something that you would want to prohibit?
Kareem Creighton again.
What does it mean for organizations who really feel their charge is to make sure that every Georgian, in this case, who is eligible casts a ballot, that they're registered to vote. It leaves a limbo for them because they don't know what's going to potentially land them, at least in a courtroom, potentially in jail for doing nothing more than what we would say a good Samaritan would do in every other context outside of voting.
Again, the fear, the cruelty, that is the point. And it's not just Georgia. Since the record-breaking 2020 election, lawmakers in 45 states have introduced bills making it harder to vote. More than 440 restrictive bills were introduced in 2021 alone. So much of this is in service of curbing so-called voter fraud. It's the same flag under which Miss Livy was tried for election tampering. When we come back, how we fight back against bogus voter fraud claims. Why do you think some people think voter fraud is so pervasive? I mean, it seems we have much more evidence of voter suppression than voter fraud in this country. But people cling to it. They really tend to insist that it's rampant, it's everywhere, and it's all the time. Why do you think that is?
Sometimes people play games. And so, I would guarantee you some of the main people who are trying to say voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud is something that they are doing, and they're trying to keep it hid. So those same people who are so quick to say it's voter fraud, I believe those are the ones that's committing it.
It's projection.
Yeah, exactly.
That was Miss Olivia Coley Pearson, former commissioner in Douglas Coffee County in South Georgia, where we started this mini-series. When you think a little more on the claim of voter fraud, you'll notice it actually goes beyond projection. It's fear-mongering and disinformation, because the people who cling to it know voter fraud isn't a real thing.
Voter fraud as such is like astonishingly rare. You're more likely to get struck by lightning as to run into examples of people, intentionally casting ballots when they're not permitted.
That was Kareem Creighton from the Brennan Center. They looked into it and found that voter fraud is so rare that out of 1 billion votes cast between 2000 and 2014, only 31 were possibly fraudulent. 31 out of 1 billion.
It is difficult to imagine anybody at the risk of imprisonment is going to do all the work necessary so that just one vote gets in on the books. But again, the idea of anything that looks significant and widespread, the story of fraud is, laughable.
About 2/3 of eligible American voters cast their ballot in 2020. That was the highest voter turnout since 1900. Voters in Georgia also turned out in record numbers. In fact, Black voters drove nearly half of the state's electorate growth from 2000 to 2020. An increased number of Americans chose to vote by mail. Ballot drop boxes were available all over the country. Georgians in particular used nearly 300 ballot boxes across 112 counties.
Which were a lifesaver, during that time period. And what it did was it expanded the opportunity for individuals to not have to travel far, because not all polling places for people are like right down the street or right around the corner. Some people have to drive 5 miles or so to get to their polling location.
More options and access to voting meant more people could and did vote. And some folks voted early in person to avoid Georgia's notoriously long lines on Election Day.
I did the early vote. I got in there early because I like to do it early. I don't like to wait. I don't stand in, hour and hour line.
Andre Smith lives in Atlanta, Georgia. He's been a registered voter in the state for 40 years. So he was shocked to find out he couldn't vote in 2020.
I went to go vote, and it was me and my neighbor. We all went down to vote. and got in line, and for some reason it's like, well, you can't vote. What do you mean I can't vote? Well, our records show that you're a felon. I was like, a felon? I was like, I've never been in prison in my life. I was like, you guys are mistaken. That's like, well, no, our records state that you're a felon.
To be clear, people with felony convictions shouldn't lose their right to vote. And there are advocates working hard to redress felon disenfranchisement.
And then the neighbor that I was with, she went into the same issue. And her issue, while she was standing there with me, the voting staff, they was in a corner having a conversation, and they was mumbling towards one another and trying to figure out what was going on. And they came back and told her that, well, the records show that, you're deceased. So all we're both sitting there like dazed and confused, like, what is going on?
Andre and his neighbor were 2 of 300,000 voters purged from the Georgia voter rolls.
And for no apparent reason, they just start purging people because, there was a very important election coming up and they didn't want certain people to vote.
Andre reached out to Fair Fight Action and was able to file a lawsuit along with several other similarly impacted people to get their voting rights reinstated. And he was able to vote with a provisional ballot in 2020. Democrats Raphael Warnock and John Ossoff were elected to the United States Senate, and Joe Biden won the state by a razor-thin margin of 11,000 votes, a result of the hard work of advocates and voting rights organizations across the state.
10 years ago, people didn't think Georgia was possible. A whole crew of us, a whole crew of leaders and people who really been working that for 10 years. And now we're really a battleground, right? It was a crap ton of organizing and leadership and work.
Whenever more Americans have access to their voting rights, progressive change can happen.
The reason people are trying to limit the opportunity to vote for a lot of people is they know what happens when people show up.
Regressive politics cannot be perpetuated.
The sad part of it is we are becoming a rapidly more diverse country. Georgia is a good example of it. We're not too far from the moment where white people in Georgia are not a majority. And rather than see that as an opportunity, right, identifying ways that our new and more diverse communities can be sort of brought together, or you can appeal to them to get, your preferred party elected. What seems to come instead is we want to stay in power, and we want to stay in power in the terms that we currently operate on. It's really disturbing to me that too often, it looks like a white Republican Party is perfectly comfortable being white and not really reaching into communities that could be, friendly to them if they are willing to shift.
Those on the far right started to fight back. Claims of voter fraud followed the electoral gains in 2020.
The reaction to that was not to increase the infrastructure, right? So you wouldn't have lines that lasted that long. Instead, what you found was they attacked the support.
Other voter suppression laws are getting propped up as well.
SB 189, which just been signed, is going even further, right, in doing what we call, this malicious weaponizing or deputizing, right? Just regular citizens to now be a part of limiting, people's right to vote. And so this bill, with razor sharp precision, now makes it more convenient for just any plain old Joe and Jack to go down to their local election office and challenge their neighbors.
You heard that right. SB 189 now makes it possible for any old Joe, Jack, or Jill to challenge the right of other citizens of Georgia to vote, under the claim of election security. Before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, voter suppression manifested itself in very clear ways, with literacy tests and counting pennies in a jar.
But how it looks now is it is sort of the benign architecture of the state, right, in terms of things like exact match, in terms of the mass voter purges, mass voter challenges that have been fully resurrected that came out of the 1940s are now back here. on steroids in Georgia across America with a direct tie to this country's racist history trying to prevent Black enfranchisement and full citizenship.
All of these examples fuel LaTosha's fight against voter suppression and the systems that allow it to continue to be carried out.
And it happens in a spectrum. So it's not just one thing, and it's a cumulative effect, right? The whole idea is kind of like death by a thousand cuts.
Right.
So you don't get it this way, you get it this way, you get it this way. And so I think that has been part of why I'm such a staunch fighter against voter suppression.
People have got to realize, number one, that it's real, it's happening. They are targeting people. And we've got to fight back. We've got to fight back. We don't just lie down and take it. Our stories need to be told, and we need to let people know this is what happened. We're not settling for it.
Fighting back is one of the reasons Miss Livy partnered with Black Voters Matter Fund. And one of the ways they fight back is through litigation.
We sued the state of Georgia for the creation of SB 202. We're one of the named plaintiffs. We have also been a part of giving testimony in the case in Georgia. People oftentimes say, when you ask about what do the challengers say when we file these types of lawsuits, is they say it's neutral. We're not saying that it's, you can't read into this legislation that we've written that it's targeting Black folks or brown folks, right, or young people, right? It's neutral on its face. These are done in order to make the process safer and more efficient, right?
But civil rights litigators are able to argue with the courts that the impact of these seemingly race-neutral laws disproportionately affect Black and brown people.
They thought it was a trick. They thought that was going to allow them to be able to create discriminatory laws and hide their hand of purpose. And so despite that challenge, that is the arguments that we make when we go to court, is that even though it looks benign on its face, its application has a malicious force behind it, and it's restricting Black voters and brown voters, right, and Asian voters.
April reminds everyone that voting shouldn't be the only way we get involved.
It is a systemic problem, and it shouldn't be our problem, right? But at the end of the day, we have to understand that in this country, policy that we live by are very impacted by corporations and lobbyists. Is those people who are seeking profit are paying the representatives that you're sending to Congress or to the state houses or to the city council. They're giving them lots of money. Elections are very important, but also important is you using other, tools of liberation to win. Because if they don't think your vote is important, maybe that protest might help them change their mind, right? Because I always tell people the Voting Rights Act came largely due not because we voted for somebody, because remember, folks like Dr. King and others who created a Southern strategy, right, to go and do nonviolence and disrupt things as usual. So you're not just going to be able to go eat and then we can't eat. So we're going to go to your counters. You're not going to be able to just ride in these buses to go see your family, right, in the front, and we got to go to the back. So we started sitting in the front. We started registering folks to vote. We started marching. We started sending our children. And when those children got arrested, there was 300 more behind them. So they created an organizing strategy, right? Voting, organizing, and all of that is what turned America upside down and I tell people all the time in the Montgomery boycott, people think that Rosa Parks and the others just didn't sit one day and the next day they were able to. It took a year. It took a year of folks not riding that bus to get that corporation, that company, the bus company, and the city government to then create laws that made it unlawful to restrict, the riding of buses and seats for Black folks to just a certain part on the bus. Voting is a part, but it is not the only thing. And if all you're doing is voting, you're not doing enough to help change this democracy.
Especially if you live in a state or neighborhood where you have a relatively easy time with casting a ballot.
So we have to use all of our tools to respond to, the insidious and malicious use or misuse of corporations have on our state representatives and congressional representatives.
There's more we can accomplish when the people get together.
There are people who have malicious intent to make sure that their rights and their family and their legacies are protected. But the story doesn't have to end there. The story ends where the people demand it end. When we all come together, we can change things.
We can change things. And as the general elections come closer on November 5th, we have to remember that we can demand better from our leaders. And like April, Latasha, Miss Livy, Lauren, and Kareem have said, you cannot stay on the sideline. Get involved in the process. Visit fairfightaction.com and blackvotersmatterfund.org to get involved. To get set up for the polls this November and to learn more about your voting rights, go to benjerry.com/vote. In our final episode in this mini-series on voting rights, we look at the state of voting rights in the South and its implications for the rest of the country. Into the Mix is a Ben & Jerry's podcast produced with Vox Creative. This episode was written by Priscilla Alabi. The Vox Creative team includes lead producers Priscilla Alabi and Jules Bradley, production supervisor Taylor Henry, and production manager Jessica Bay. Martha D. Sally is our supervising producer. Anu Subramanian is our executive producer. The team also includes Amy Wenzel, Senior Manager of Creative Services Michelle Blam, Associate Director of Project Management, Director of Post-Production Greg Russ, and Post-Production Manager Andrew Hammond. Kyle Neal engineered this episode. Felicia Dominguez is our junior engineer. Original music by Israel Tutson. A special thank you to Kelly Young, our sensitivity reader, and Zoe Mullick, our fact checker, and to Ariane Young for her support. And to Better Georgia. The Ben & Jerry's team includes Jay Tandon, Jay Curley, Sanjana Mahesh, Chris Miller, and Palika Mako. I'm Ashley C. Ford. Thank you for listening.
Vox Creative.